The clinking of wine glasses and soft hum of jazz filled the air as I stepped into La Dolce Vita. The kind of upscale restaurant where deals are sealed with a handshake and a nod, where men in tailored suits sit next to women dressed to impress. I wasn't there for dinner, though. A quick meeting with a potential client was the only thing on my agenda. Until I saw her. At first, my mind refused to process it. A flicker of blonde hair caught my eye, unmistakable even in the dim lighting. Anna, my Anna, the woman I had spent the last 12 years building a life with, was seated at a small corner table. But it wasn't the sight of her that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was the man sitting across from her. Thomas Hamilton. He had the look of someone who thought the world owed him something, and from what I knew, he was getting it. Tall, polished, powerful. His eyes were fixed on Anna like she was his personal prize. My hands tightened into fists by my sides, and for a moment, I thought about marching over there, flipping the table, and demanding answers. But I didn't. I couldn't. Years of controlling boardroom negotiations had taught me one thing: stay calm, observe, and act when it's to your advantage. Instead, I took a step back into the shadows, pretending I hadn't seen a thing. Anna laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his, and I felt my stomach twist. That laugh. It had been mine once. Now it was his. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The client. I texted him, making up some excuse about a delayed meeting, but my mind wasn't there. I slipped out of the restaurant, letting the cool night air hit my face, though it did nothing to cool the rage building inside me. The signs had been there. Late nights at the office, unexplained business trips. But I'd pushed them aside, convincing myself Anna was simply busy, committed to her career as an architect. She had landed a major client recently, a development project she couldn't stop talking about. What she hadn't mentioned was that the client was Thomas. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through her messages. There they were, late-night texts to a number I didn't recognize, frequent calls that lasted hours. Thomas. I clenched the phone in my hand, my knuckles turning white. The proof was there, undeniable and gut-wrenching. But what came next, I wasn't sure. For the next few days, I operated on autopilot. At home, I said nothing. I watched her carefully, noticing every little detail I had missed before, the way she avoided eye contact. How her phone was always face down on the table. She had no idea I knew. Not yet. I debated confronting her right then and there. Just spilling everything out. The affair, the lies, the betrayal. But a part of me craved something more. Revenge wasn't just about catching her in the act, it was about making her realize the cost of what she had done. Instead of lashing out, I turned my focus on Thomas. If he thought he could take what was mine and walk away unscathed, he was sorely mistaken. I had connections, power, influence. Thomas may have had his charm and success, but I had something far more dangerous: access. It didn't take much to start digging into his business deals. I made a few calls, pulling some favors from old friends, and what I found confirmed what I suspected. Thomas wasn't as clean as he pretended to be. Behind that shiny exterior were cracks. Illegal contracts, under-the-table deals. Nothing that would send him to jail, but enough to ruin his reputation. But I didn't move in just yet. No, this had to be carefully timed, orchestrated like a masterful piece of business strategy. At night, lying next to Anna in bed, I listened to her breathing, pretending I didn't know. I wondered if she ever thought about the risk, if she ever imagined what would happen if I found out. But as the days passed, it became clear. She wasn't thinking at all. She was lost in the thrill of her affair, blind to the destruction that was coming. One evening, after she came home from one of her so-called late meetings, I finally spoke. "We need to talk." Her eyes flickered for a moment, but she sat down, pretending to be oblivious. "Sure, about what?" I studied her face, wondering if she felt even an ounce of guilt. "I know you're seeing someone else." Her face froze. The color drained from her cheeks as she stared back at me, silent. Then, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice steady but cold. "His name is Thomas." I already knew that, but hearing her say it hit differently. Like a final confirmation that the life we had built together was a lie. "Why?" I asked, not sure what answer I was even hoping for. She shook her head. Because he's different. He's not you, Josh. He's powerful, he's confident, he's everything you used to be." Her words hung in the air like poison, seeping into every corner of the room. I didn't flinch. I had heard enough. Without another word, I stood up and left the room. She had no idea what was coming next. But she would soon. The next morning, Anna acted as if our conversation the night before had been nothing more than a passing breeze. She went about her day as usual, prepping for meetings, talking about her next big project. I listened quietly, nodding where I needed to, but my mind was far from the mundane details of her schedule. I had work of my own to do. The investigation into Thomas's business dealings had already unearthed some interesting leads. It was time to dig deeper. That afternoon, I called in another favor, this time with a lawyer friend who specialized in corporate law. I needed every bit of dirt on Thomas's financial history, specifically anything that could be used to undermine his upcoming deal. "What are you looking for, exactly?" Jeff asked, a curious edge to his voice. "Anything that can make him bleed," I replied coldly. It didn't take long. By the following week, I had everything I needed. A trail of backdoor contracts, shady financial moves, and underhanded dealings that could be catastrophic if brought to light. Thomas had built his empire on a house of cards, and all it needed was a little push to come crashing down. While Anna thought she was hiding an affair, I was setting the stage for the real downfall. I attended meetings and social events, all while keeping a close watch on Thomas. He was as smug as ever, unaware of the chaos I was about to unleash. That weekend, Anna and I were invited to a business dinner. I knew Thomas would be there, and part of me almost looked forward to seeing his face, not as the man stealing my wife, but as a man standing on the brink of losing everything. As we arrived at the event, I spotted him immediately. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he was schmoozing with investors, effortlessly charming the room. Anna slipped away to speak to someone she knew, giving me the opportunity I'd been waiting for. I approached Thomas, my smile never wavering. He extended his hand, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. "Josh, good to see you," he said, offering a practiced grin. "I hear you're doing well with the new deals in Seattle." "Can't complain," I replied, shaking his hand. "And I hear you're working on something big yourself." He smiled wider, clearly enjoying the praise. "Oh, yes. It's going to be a game changer for the company. Just a matter of time before everything's finalized." I nodded, sipping my drink. "Well, I'm sure nothing will go wrong, right? You've got everything under control." His expression faltered for a split second, just enough for me to catch it. That was the thing about men like Thomas, they never considered the possibility of losing. But they should. I excused myself and left the dinner early. I had planted the seed, and now it was time to let it grow. The next few weeks were a waiting game. I kept things quiet, both at home and in the business world. Anna and I exchanged fewer words by the day, but I no longer cared. My attention was on the bigger picture, how to dismantle Thomas without him knowing I was the one pulling the strings. Through a few strategic leaks to the right people, whispers began circulating about Thomas's shaky dealings. His investors grew uneasy. They didn't pull out immediately, but the doubts were there. A seed of mistrust had been planted in their minds, just as I had planned. Then, I made my move. I contacted one of Thomas's main business partners, a company he relied on for his upcoming project. I knew the CEO well enough to make the conversation casual at first, but eventually, I let slip just enough of Thomas's missteps to set off alarms. "He's been cutting corners for years," I said over lunch. "You might want to be careful with this deal. He's skating on thin ice, and if things go south, you'll be the one left cleaning up the mess." By the time our conversation ended, I knew the damage was done. The CEO wasn't going to walk away immediately, but he'd have second thoughts. And in business, second thoughts were all it took to derail an entire operation. A week later, the first domino fell. The company pulled out of the deal, citing concerns over Thomas's financial stability. It wasn't public yet, but the ripples were already starting. Thomas's other investors caught wind of the shift, and soon enough, they too were reconsidering their involvement. I watched from the sidelines, staying close enough to observe but far enough to remain invisible. Anna, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the chaos I was orchestrating. She was still spending late nights with Thomas, thinking she had traded up for a man on the rise. Little did she know, the man she had left me for was about to hit rock bottom. One evening, as we sat in silence over dinner, she casually mentioned Thomas's recent troubles, her brow furrowed in mild concern. "He's been having some issues with investors lately," she said. "Nothing major, but he's a little stressed." I almost laughed at her naivety. If only she knew how deep those issues ran. Instead, I nodded sympathetically, playing the part of the supportive husband. "I'm sure he'll figure it out," I said, my voice even. Inside, I was savoring every moment. As the days passed, the cracks in Thomas's empire widened. His partners began to distance themselves, and rumors about his questionable business practices spread like wildfire. The once powerful man was now scrambling to keep everything from falling apart. And that's when I struck again. I made one final call, this time to the media. A well-placed tip about Thomas's shady dealings was all it took for the story to break. Within hours, headlines painted him as a corrupt businessman on the verge of financial ruin. Thomas's world collapsed. His investors pulled out, his deals fell through, and his reputation was left in tatters. The man who had taken my wife now had nothing. Anna didn't say a word the night the news broke. She sat in stunned silence, staring at the TV as Thomas's face flashed across the screen. Bankrupt. Ruined. I didn't need to say anything. The look on her face said it all. The silence in our home became unbearable after the news broke. Anna hardly spoke. The glow she used to carry, the confidence that she had found someone better than me, had disappeared overnight. She looked lost, her expression blank, as if she was still trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. I kept my distance, giving her room to process, though a part of me wanted to revel in her regret. This was what she deserved, watching the man she had chosen over me fall apart. Still, I played the part of the unknowing, detached husband, observing from the shadows as her world crumbled along with Thomas's empire. One morning, she finally broke the silence. "Josh, we need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She sat across from me at the breakfast table, her eyes puffy from lack of sleep. I didn't respond immediately. I looked up from my coffee, meeting her gaze with indifference. "About what?" She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, her eyes darting around the room before settling on me again. "About us. About everything that's happened." I waited, letting her feel the weight of her own words. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice cracking slightly. I thought Thomas was someone different. I thought he could give me something you couldn't, and I was wrong." She paused, searching for the right words. "I never meant for it to go this far, Josh. I never thought. I didn't know he would lose everything." For a brief moment, I considered telling her the truth, that it wasn't some random stroke of bad luck that had brought Thomas down. That I had been the one to orchestrate every detail of his downfall. But I didn't. There was no need for her to know. The outcome was the same. "You destroyed our marriage for a man who had nothing to offer you," I said, my voice cold and distant. "And now, you're realizing too late that you've lost both of us." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. I had expected this moment for weeks, her coming to terms with her betrayal, her regret, but now that it was here, all I felt was emptiness. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything to fix this, to make things right between us." I almost laughed at the absurdity of her plea. There was no fixing this. She had burned the bridge the moment she walked into Thomas's arms, and now she was left standing in the ashes of her choices. "I don't think you understand, Anna," I said, my tone hard. "This isn't something you can just apologize for. You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." She looked down, tears spilling onto her cheeks as she realized the full extent of what she had done. There was no forgiveness waiting for her on the other side of this conversation. Only the cold reality of the life she had thrown away. I stood up, leaving her sitting at the table alone, her sobs echoing through the house as I walked away. Over the next few days, I began to put the pieces of my life back together. Anna's desperate attempts to salvage our marriage became background noise as I refocused on my business and personal goals. She had chosen her path, and now I was choosing mine. But something gnawed at me. Despite everything, there was an unfinished chapter in my revenge, one that Anna had yet to fully grasp. She thought Thomas's downfall was just a cruel twist of fate, an unfortunate turn of events that had left him bankrupt and ruined. But the truth was much darker, and I wanted her to know it. One evening, as she sat in the living room staring blankly at her phone, I decided it was time. I sat down across from her, watching as her eyes slowly lifted to meet mine. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, a desperation for something, anything, that would ease her guilt. "Do you know why Thomas lost everything?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp. She blinked, confusion crossing her face. "Because his investors pulled out, and the deal fell through." It wasn't his fault. I smiled, a cold satisfaction spreading through me. It wasn't just bad luck, Anna. It was me. Her eyes widened, shock flooding her features. What are you talking about? I'm the reason Thomas lost everything. I made sure his partners pulled out of the deal. I leaked information about his business practices. I destroyed him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. And I did it all because you chose him over me. Anna stared at me, her mouth slightly open, struggling to comprehend what I had just said. Her face drained of color as the reality of my words settled in. You did this? She whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded slowly. Every step of the way. He thought he could take you from me and walk away without consequences. But he was wrong. He paid the price for his arrogance, and so did you. She sat there in stunned silence, her eyes brimming with tears. I could see the realization dawning on her, the full weight of her betrayal and the devastation it had caused. She hadn't just ruined her marriage. She had aligned herself with a man who was now nothing but a shell of his former self, thanks to me. Josh, she started, but I cut her off. Save it, I said, standing up. You made your choice, and now you get to live with it. I left her there, broken and defeated, just as she had left me when she chose Thomas. I felt no remorse, no guilt. Only the satisfaction of knowing that I had exacted my revenge and come out stronger on the other side. As I walked out of the room, I felt a sense of closure. The chapter of Anna and Thomas was over. It was time for me to move on and build a life where betrayal no longer held any power over me. Anna was left alone, staring at the empty space where I had been, knowing that she had lost everything, and that it was all her fault. The days that followed were eerily quiet. Anna's initial shock had given way to a kind of fragile stillness, as if she were waiting for something, maybe hoping for some chance to fix the mess she'd made. But there was nothing left to fix. She kept herself busy, cleaning the house more than usual, cooking meals she knew I liked, making small attempts to reconnect. But I saw through it all. It was a desperate, hollow effort to return to some version of our life that no longer existed. I stopped coming home early. Work became an excuse to stay out late, to avoid her awkward attempts at conversation. I knew she felt abandoned, that she was living with the consequences of her actions every moment of the day. The guilt and regret clung to her, but it was far too late for apologies. One evening, when I finally got home, she was sitting on the couch, waiting for me. Her eyes were red, likely from crying, though she tried to hide it. Josh, we can't keep going like this, she said, her voice small, pleading. I glanced at her, then at the TV, ignoring the weight in her words. What do you expect me to do, Anna? Pretend everything's fine? That you didn't throw away our marriage? She shook her head, tears brimming again. No, I know I messed up. I'm not asking for everything to go back to the way it was, but I can't keep living in this silence, in this house where you won't even look at me. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It had been building up for days, the inevitability of this moment. So, what then? You want me to forgive you, just like that? I don't expect you to forgive me, but… She trailed off, her voice cracking. I don't know what else to do. I've lost everything, Josh. I've lost you. I've lost him. I know I deserve it, but please, please don't leave me like this. Her words hung in the air, but they didn't reach me. She didn't understand. It wasn't just that she had cheated. It was that she had shattered the trust and respect that had once held us together. What we had was beyond repair. I already left you, Anna, I said quietly. The moment you chose him, you lost me. She slumped forward, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. I watched, emotionless. This was the price of betrayal, the consequence she couldn't escape. And the truth was, I didn't feel pity for her anymore. Only the cold reality that we were done. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice steady. Her sobs stopped instantly, and she looked up at me, horror in her eyes. No, Josh, please. We can work through this. No, we can't, I replied. There's nothing left to work through. Her face twisted in desperation. I'll do anything, Josh. I'll leave, Stop, I cut her off, my tone final. You've already done enough. It's over. She broke down again, but this time, I didn't stay to watch. I walked out, leaving her alone with her guilt and regret. It was time for me to free myself from the wreckage of our relationship, once and for all. The divorce papers were filed within days. And Anna's response came as expected, tears, pleading, and eventually, resignation. She had no choice but to accept that I was moving on, though I could see the weight of her mistakes bearing down on her with every conversation. I moved out of the house soon after, renting an apartment downtown while we sorted through the legalities. The distance between us, both physical and emotional, gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. For the first time in months, I felt free. My focus shifted entirely to my business. The satisfaction of bringing Thomas down had long since faded, replaced by the more meaningful task of building something that was mine. I threw myself into work, expanding my network and closing deals that further solidified my place as a key player in the industry. One afternoon, as I was reviewing documents in my office, a knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to see Jeff, my lawyer friend, standing in the doorway with a knowing smile. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, come in," I said, leaning back in my chair. He sat down, placing a folder on my desk. "The divorce is nearly finalized. Just a few more signatures and it'll be official." I nodded, taking the folder and flipping through the papers. It was a surreal feeling, putting the final stamp on a chapter of my life that had consumed me for so long. But it also felt right. "You're doing the right thing, Josh," Jeff said, his tone sincere. "She made her choice, and you're making yours." I closed the folder, nodding again. "Yeah, I know." Jeff stood up, giving me a pat on the back. "Take some time for yourself after this is done. You've earned it." After he left, I sat alone in my office, the weight of the last few months finally lifting. The chaos, the betrayal, the revenge, it was all behind me now. Anna would soon be nothing more than a memory, a reminder of the cost of misplaced trust. As the divorce became official, I felt a sense of finality. Anna had tried to reach out a few more times, leaving voicemails that I never listened to, sending texts I deleted without reading. There was nothing more to say. Thomas, too, had faded from the picture. The man who had once stood as a powerful figure in both Anna's life and my own was now a shadow of his former self. His bankruptcy had become public knowledge, and his name no longer carried the weight it once did. He had been forgotten by those who once admired him while I continued to rise. There was no satisfaction left in his downfall. No sense of victory. Only the knowledge that I had taken control of my life, that I had not allowed myself to be a victim of Anna's choices. And that was enough. I spent the next few months focusing on myself, rediscovering the parts of me that had been lost in the chaos. I traveled, reconnected with old friends, and found solace in the simplicity of life without the burden of a broken marriage. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights flicker below, I realized something. The revenge, the pain, the anger, it had all served a purpose. It had brought me to this moment, where I could stand on my own, stronger and more resilient than I had ever been before. And as I stared out into the night, I knew one thing for sure: I was finally free. The weeks that followed the finalization of the divorce felt like a strange blend of liberation and loneliness. I no longer carried the weight of Anna's betrayal or the constant tension of our broken marriage. But the silence that filled my new apartment was deafening at times. There were moments when I caught myself staring at my phone, expecting a message from her, a futile attempt to rebuild something that was beyond repair. But I knew better. I had made my decision, and I didn't regret it. Work kept me busy, and I threw myself into it with more focus than ever. The success of my business became my primary outlet, and with each new deal, I felt more like myself again. I began to reconnect with friends, attending social events, networking with industry contacts. It felt good to be moving forward, to no longer be defined by what had happened between Anna and me. One evening, as I was sitting in a bar with a group of colleagues after a particularly successful negotiation, I found myself in a conversation with an old acquaintance, Emily. We hadn't spoken in years, but she had always been someone I admired, intelligent, driven, and with a dry sense of humor that I appreciated. We spent the evening catching up, exchanging stories about work, life, and everything in between. At one point, she leaned in and smiled. "You seem different. Happier, maybe." I raised an eyebrow. "Happier? Not the word I would have used for the last few months." She laughed softly. "No, but it's there. Something's shifted. You've let go of something, haven't you?" I shrugged, taking a sip of my drink. "Yeah, I guess I have." It was the first time I'd really acknowledged it out loud. The fact that I had moved on, that I had let go of the anger, the hurt, and the need for revenge. It had all been necessary in the moment, but now, as I sat there with Emily, I realized that I was free of it. We talked late into the night, and by the time we left the bar, I felt a sense of clarity. The future no longer seemed weighed down by the past. I wasn't defined by what had happened with Anna or by the revenge I had exacted on Thomas. I was simply Josh, a man rebuilding his life, one step at a time. A few months after my divorce, I received an unexpected email from Anna. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but it stopped me in my tracks. Subject: closure. Josh, I know we haven't spoken in months, and maybe it's for the best, but I've been doing a lot of thinking. I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you the truth. What I did was selfish. I betrayed you in ways that I'm still coming to terms with. And in the end, I ruined my own life as much as I ruined yours. But what's been haunting me most is knowing that you were always a better person than I gave you credit for. You didn't deserve any of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything, really. But I want you to know that I regret everything. I'm trying to rebuild my life, and part of that is acknowledging the damage I caused. I hope you found some peace. Anna. I stared at the email, unsure of how to feel. I had spent so long hating her, blaming her for everything that had gone wrong. But now, reading her words, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel anything, really. I closed the laptop, letting the email sit unread in my mind. It wasn't closure I needed anymore. I had already moved on, and that was enough. A few days later, I found myself driving past the old house where Anna and I used to live. I hadn't been there since I moved out, and something about seeing it again stirred a sense of finality within me. The place held so many memories, both good and bad, but none of them felt relevant anymore. It was part of a life that no longer existed. As I sat in my car, watching the familiar house fade into the distance, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I was no longer trapped by the past. The house, the marriage, the revenge, it was all behind me now. I pulled away, the road stretching out ahead of me, open and full of possibilities. There was no more bitterness, no more anger. Just the quiet, peaceful understanding that life goes on, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, I felt a genuine smile cross my face. I was free. Weeks passed, and my life began to take on a new rhythm. The heaviness that had once consumed me was gone, replaced by a calm sense of determination. I was no longer looking back, no longer questioning the choices that had brought me here. Instead, I was focused on what came next. Emily and I had started spending more time together. It wasn't anything serious, not yet at least, but there was something natural about our connection. We shared laughs, long conversations, and an understanding of life that didn't require explanation. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something with someone who saw me for who I was, not for my success, not for my status, but for the person I had become. One evening, we were sitting at a cafe downtown, talking about our latest business ventures, when she asked something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about her?" Her question was straightforward, but there was no malice in it. She wasn't prying, just curious. I paused, considering my answer. "I used to," I said slowly. "I thought about her every day. Especially after everything fell apart. But now, not so much. She's part of my past, but she doesn't define my future." Emily smiled softly. "That's good. It means you've really moved on." I nodded, realizing how true that statement was. I didn't harbor any bitterness toward Anna anymore. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. It wasn't about revenge or closure now, it was about finding peace and moving forward. Our conversation drifted back to lighter topics, but Emily's question lingered in my mind. It wasn't so much about Anna as it was about me, about the journey I'd been on, about the man I was becoming. Later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The divorce, the downfall of Thomas, the new life I was building, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that were finally starting to fit together. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. One evening, months after my divorce had been finalized and Thomas had been reduced to nothing more than a distant memory, I received an unexpected call from an old business associate. His name was Richard, and he was someone I had worked with years ago, back when my company was still in its early stages. We hadn't spoken in a long time, but his voice on the other end of the line was as familiar as ever. "Josh, I've been following your progress," Richard said, "and I have an opportunity I think you'd be interested in." I leaned back in my chair, intrigued. "What kind of opportunity?" He explained the details: a massive contract with a global firm. Something that could catapult my business to the next level. It was the kind of deal that could define a career, the kind of project that would put me on the map in ways I hadn't even considered. But there was a catch. The firm had previously worked with Thomas. They hadn't cut ties with him after his downfall, and they still had a lingering association with his name, even though he was bankrupt and his reputation was in shambles. If I took the deal, it would mean entering a space that he had once occupied. It would mean facing the remnants of a man I had destroyed. "Are you interested?" Richard asked after a long pause on my end. I hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Yes," I said, "let's move forward." The decision wasn't about Thomas anymore. It wasn't about revenge or proving something. It was about me, about my business, and about the future I was carving out for myself. Thomas had been reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the story of my life, and this deal was my way of reclaiming the space he had once occupied, on my terms. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of clarity settle over me. This was the next step, the next chapter in my journey. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first discovered Anna's affair. I wasn't the man consumed by revenge or bitterness. I was stronger now, more focused, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. That night, I met Emily for dinner at a restaurant we'd been wanting to try for weeks. As we sat across from each other, laughing and talking about everything from work to travel plans, I realized how much my life had changed since the day I found out about Anna's betrayal. I had built something new, something real, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. After dinner, as we walked back to my apartment, Emily slipped her hand into mine. "You seem different," she said, glancing up at me. "More at peace." I smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I am. And I meant it." Months passed, and life continued to fall into place. The business was thriving, and my deal with the global firm had exceeded expectations. Emily and I had grown closer, and though we weren't rushing anything, the connection between us felt real and steady. It was a sharp contrast to the chaos of the past year. I was finally in control of my life, steering it where I wanted it to go. But just as I was starting to believe the past was fully behind me, I received another surprise, an invitation to a charity gala hosted by one of the firms I had been working with. It was a high-profile event, one that everyone in the industry attended, and I knew it would be good for business. I also knew that Anna would likely be there. I hadn't seen her since the divorce, hadn't spoken to her since the email she sent months ago. I didn't know what state she was in, or what her life had become after everything collapsed around her. Part of me wanted to see her, to gauge how she had moved on, if she even had. Another part of me wanted to avoid her altogether. In the end, I decided to go. Emily came with me, and as we entered the grand ballroom, filled with industry elites, I scanned the crowd, wondering if Anna would be here, wondering if Thomas would show up, despite his fall from grace. But there was no sign of either of them. The night went on smoothly, small talk, introductions, discussions about new ventures. Emily was by my side the entire time, and I could tell she fit perfectly into this world. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. And then, just as the evening was winding down, I saw her. Anna stood near the bar, her back to me, talking to a man I didn't recognize. She looked different, older, maybe, or just worn down by everything that had happened. Her once bright and confident demeanor was replaced by a more subdued, almost somber presence. For a brief moment, I considered walking over, saying something, anything, but I stopped myself. There was no reason to reopen old wounds. I had moved on, and so had she. As Emily and I prepared to leave, our paths crossed. Anna saw me, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. We both froze for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. Emily, sensing the tension, stepped aside to give us a moment. "Josh," Anna said softly, her voice uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Likewise," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She looked down, as if searching for words. You seem good." "I am," I said simply. "I hope you are too." There was a long pause. And for a moment, I could see the regret in her eyes, the same regret she had expressed in her email. But there was something else there too, acceptance, perhaps. "I'm trying," she finally said. "It's been hard, but I'm working through it." I nodded. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She smiled faintly, then glanced at Emily, who was waiting patiently a few steps away. "She seems nice." "She is," I said. "She's been good for me." Anna didn't respond, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. We had both moved on, in our own ways, and there was no more bitterness between us. Just two people who had once been part of each other's lives, now on different paths. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving Anna behind for the last time. The weeks after the gala felt like a turning point. There was a sense of finality now, a sense that the last remaining ties to my old life had been severed. Anna was part of my past, but she no longer held any power over me. I had faced her, faced what we had become, and walked away with my head held high. Emily and I continued to grow closer. Our relationship wasn't rushed or forced, but it felt right, like something that had been waiting to happen all along. She understood me in ways that no one else had, and I found myself looking forward to the future with her by my side. One weekend, we took a trip to a cabin in the mountains, just the two of us. It was a chance to get away from the city, from work, from everything. And just enjoy the simplicity of being together. On the last night of our trip, as we sat by the fireplace, Emily turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked quietly. I smiled, taking her hand in mine. I used to think I had everything planned out, my career, my life, my marriage. And then everything changed. But now, I don't need to plan everything anymore. I'm just enjoying what we have. She smiled back, leaning her head on my shoulder. "That's what I like about you, Josh. You're always moving forward." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. I thought about everything that had happened. Anna's betrayal, the revenge on Thomas, the divorce, and now, this new chapter with Emily. It had been a long, painful journey, but I had come out stronger on the other side. As I stared into the flames, I realized something important. The revenge, the hurt, the anger, they had all been necessary steps in my healing process. But they didn't define me anymore. What defined me now was the life I was building, the future I was creating with Emily, the business I had worked so hard to grow, and the man I had become through it all. I was no longer haunted by the past. I was no longer driven by the need to prove anything to anyone, not to Anna, not to Thomas, not to myself. I had found peace in moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly content. As the fire burned low and the stars twinkled outside the window, I wrapped my arm around Emily and pulled her closer. Whatever came next, I was ready. Months passed, and life settled into a kind of rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Work remained steady, my relationship with Emily deepened, and the past grew ever more distant, like a fading memory that no longer had a hold on me. It was a strange feeling, liberation, maybe, but also a kind of acceptance that everything that had happened had led me to this moment. Emily and I had been talking more seriously about the future, about what we wanted from our lives, both individually and together. There was no rush, no pressure to make decisions, but it felt like the right time to start imagining what the next chapter might look like. One evening, we were sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city. The air was cool, with just a hint of autumn in it, and the city below seemed to hum with the energy of change. "You ever think about where we'll be a year from now?" Emily asked, her voice soft as she leaned against me. I smiled, running my fingers through her hair. "Sometimes. But honestly, I'm more interested in where we are right now." She laughed quietly. "You're always so present. It's one of the things I love about you." I chuckled. "I've spent enough time stuck in the past. I think I deserve to be present for once." She tilted her head up to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you ever regret anything? The choices you made? The way things ended with Anna? Do you ever wish you'd done things differently?" Her question hung in the air for a moment, and I found myself reflecting on it, not with the bitterness or regret I once might have felt, but with a kind of clarity that had come with time. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. I did what I had to do at the time. I was angry, hurt. And yeah, maybe the way it all ended wasn't perfect. But it brought me here, to you. To this life." Emily smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes, an understanding that only someone who had seen the worst parts of you and still cared could have. "I'm glad you feel that way." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. I thought about everything that had happened. Anna's betrayal, the revenge on Thomas, the divorce, and now, this new chapter with Emily. It had been a long, painful journey, but I had come out stronger on the other side. As I stared into the flames, I realized something important. The revenge, the hurt, the anger, they had all been necessary steps in my healing process. But they didn't define me anymore. What defined me now was the life I was building, the future I was creating with Emily, the business I had worked so hard to grow, and the man I had become through it all. I was no longer haunted by the past. I was no longer driven by the need to prove anything to anyone, not to Anna, not to Thomas, not to myself. I had found peace in moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly content. As the fire burned low and the stars twinkled outside the window, I wrapped my arm around Emily and pulled her closer. Whatever came next, I was ready. Months passed, and life settled into a kind of rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Work remained steady, my relationship with Emily deepened, and the past grew ever more distant, like a fading memory that no longer had a hold on me. It was a strange feeling, liberation, maybe, but also a kind of acceptance that everything that had happened had led me to this moment. Emily and I had been talking more seriously about the future, about what we wanted from our lives. Both individually and together. There was no rush, no pressure to make decisions, but it felt like the right time to start imagining what the next chapter might look like. One evening, we were sitting on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city. The air was cool, with just a hint of autumn in it, and the city below seemed to hum with the energy of change. "You ever think about where we'll be a year from now?" Emily asked, her voice soft as she leaned against me. I smiled, running my fingers through her hair. "Sometimes. But honestly, I'm more interested in where we are right now." She laughed quietly. "You're always so present. It's one of the things I love about you." I chuckled. "I've spent enough time stuck in the past. I think I deserve to be present for once." She tilted her head up to look at me, her eyes searching mine. "Do you ever regret anything? The choices you made? The way things ended with Anna? Do you ever wish you'd done things differently?" Her question hung in the air for a moment, and I found myself reflecting on it, not with the bitterness or regret I once might have felt, but with a kind of clarity that had come with time. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it. I did what I had to do at the time. I was angry, hurt. And yeah, maybe the way it all ended wasn't perfect. But it brought me here, to you. To this life." Emily smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes, an understanding that only someone who had seen the worst parts of you and still cared could have. "I'm glad you feel that way." We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last of the daylight disappear behind the skyline. I thought about everything that had led me here, the heartbreak, the revenge, the slow rebuilding of my life. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't always been clean, but it had been real. And in the end, that's all that mattered. As the city lights flickered to life below us, Emily reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You know, I've been thinking." I turned to her, curious. "About what?" "About us. About where we're headed." I smiled, feeling the warmth of her words wash over me. "And where do you think we're headed?" She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I think we're headed somewhere good. I think we're building something worth holding on to." Her words echoed in my mind, and I realized how true they were. The future wasn't something to be feared anymore. It wasn't something I needed to control or plan every detail of. It was something to look forward to, something full of possibility. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of expectation or the burden of past mistakes. I felt light, free, and more certain than ever that whatever came next, I was ready for it. As the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, I leaned down and kissed Emily, letting the future unfold in front of us. I didn't know where the road would lead, but I knew that I wasn't walking it alone anymore. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. The past was behind me. The future was mine to shape. And as I held Emily close, I realized that the best part of my story was just beginning.